I would like to introduce Barry Crossno. He's our speaker this evening. He is the co-author of On Vocal Ministry, along with Brent Bill. He's the secretary of the Friends General Council, currently living in Ohio. And he has a 2-year-old son. He's a member of Arch Street. The recording is on. This meeting will record whatever noise you make. So I'm going to ask everybody but Barry to please mute yourself and unmute when you want to talk, because Barry will be happy to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lois. It's great to see you all, and I just want to say hello, Carol, and hi, Audrey. Hadn't had a chance to greet y'all yet. So glad you're on tonight. I'm imagining tonight's going to be somewhat informal because we're a pretty small group, and I'm also hoping this is going to be somewhat participatory. Yes, there are some pieces that I want to use from the pamphlet, but I'm actually really curious about the state of vocal ministry at Arch Street so that hopefully I can help offer some things that might be useful or beneficial. Lois was, along with Susanna, were sharing a little bit about that before everyone else came on. So the way I'd like to start, I'm going to assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, everybody on here knows one another, yes? Okay, great. So we'll forgo introductions as such then, and why don't we let's move into just a little bit of worship to center ourselves, a couple of minutes, and when we come out of worship, I'll break the worship. I'm going to ask whoever wants to share a little bit about the state of vocal ministry that you're experiencing right now. So let's have a bit of worship together. Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to have an opportunity just to settle a bit. So I recognize that the state of vocal ministry, in a sense, is probably complex at this moment because of the moment in time that we've been sharing together, that there's been Zoom worship. I believe Arch Street has come back into in-person worship. And so if you would, anyone who wishes to share a little bit about what you feel the state of vocal ministry is right now, and also a little bit about what do you hope to get out of this session this evening so that I can be mindful as we move through the evening.
As we discussed before the official recording started, Arch Street is silent. We often have silent meetings for the entire hour. Once in a while, one person may speak. I'm not sure what's going on, because when they do speak, they have valuable things to say. We do have a very open meeting because of our location. We have tourists who come in who sometimes think they can get up and talk about whatever they're in the mood for, what they drank last night. But most of the time, it's just plain quiet.
Thank you, Lois. Anyone else care to share? And something that occurs to me is the meeting being largely silent something that you receive? Is that a positive, you think, in the life of the meeting? Or is there hope that there might be more vocal ministry?
Yes, I really enjoy vocal ministry. I mean, mostly vocal ministry is really helpful. We had a wonderful message last week about the Holy Spirit being within and without, and it was just lovely. And I had been reading an article in Friends Journal by Stuart Masters about the Holy Spirit, and that was really terrific. No, as I said before, I think there's disincentive for vocal ministry in Arch Street. First, because we had a problem a couple of years ago with someone that came in and just kind of babbled on, and that upset a number of people. And he was eventually asked to not come back. That wasn't why. That wasn't the reason he was barred. There were other things going on. And then, as I told you before, we have a member who, whenever everything's being silent, he likes to get up and say how great it was that everyone was quiet and no one said anything. So it seems like there's huge disincentive not to give a message. And I've been to plenty of other meetings. I mean, I've been to plenty of meetings in Haddonfield, certainly, and in several meetings in Australia and in all over England. And generally, it's pretty good. I mean, people really do understand that we're there in quiet, and you're not supposed to get up and talk about whatever was on it you heard on NPR before you sat down to worship, which always drove me crazy when I heard that. Yeah. And as I told you before, we had a Christmas Eve meeting for worship a few years ago, where this man came in and started talking about how grateful he was for Quakers, and how Quakers had helped him in his life. And he was just going on in a very joyful mood. And this, a member of a clerk of another meeting stood up and told him essentially to shut up on a Christmas Eve. And I was appalled at that, really upset, because what he said was just lovely. And, you may go on a little longer, but what does it matter? He certainly wasn't being offensive, and I was enjoying it. So that's my 2 cents.
My sense is that, when you have a meeting that has an active attendance of, 30 or 40 members, you're going to get more vocal ministry. Just, the numbers are going to, more people are, statistically going to inclined to speak. But when you have 8 or 10 or 12 people, the chances of having more than 1 or 2 people speak, are reduced. So, again, it kind of comes down to encouraging, regular members to attend more, and to, just get more bodies in the meeting.
And forgive me, Zoom actually shut down on me for about the last 30 seconds. So forgive me, Tom, I lost you. Would you mind repeating a bit of that?
I was just saying that, when you have a meeting that only has 8 or 10 people present, as has been the case with our live meetings because of, COVID, and I think people are kind of catching up on travel and just aren't around. You're just going to have, you have a smaller universe of potential people who are willing to give vocal ministry. And, I guess my point is that to the extent we can get greater attendance, I think, people will be more inclined to share if we can get people to come on Sundays.
Thank you. And Audrey, am I seeing the cogs whirling in your mind?
Yeah, well, they're always whirling, but I'm thinking about a number of things. I'm thinking about when I first came to Arch Street, which was 30 plus years ago, and how rich the vocal ministry was. And I think part of it was that you had a good number of friends who were big readers. Of course, sorry, I have to go back to books, but I think that was part of it, was that they had more to refer back to or to base their being Quaker on and their approach to things. And over time, fewer of those people are with meeting. And it's like there hasn't been the same, those were big shoes to fill, and they kind of haven't been filled. Or not, there isn't the same breadth and depth of knowledge among friends, I think, is part of it, or people being accustomed to vocal ministry and referring to things. You okay there, Sandra? I did not transfer membership till fairly recently, even though I had moved out of Philly, because a lot of it had to do with my love of the vocal ministry at Arch Street. But as time passed, it just wasn't there in the same way. Not to say there was never anything that moved me, but it wasn't the same.
I think what comes to my mind as I'm hearing folks speak this evening is that, yes, we had a tradition of good vocal ministry in the past when we were larger in numbers and maybe weightier in more experienced friends. And maybe there hasn't been a way for people in my generation or my, age group or whatever, to learn that path or to take on that role. I've always been very hesitant to give vocal ministry because it's intimidating, right? And I always, remember people saying things like, don't be trite. On the other hand, there's the old, I forget who wrote it, this message may not be for you, but it may be for somebody else in the room, that kind of a thing. And it is true that this Zoom mode has tamped us all down. You kind of get used to it on one hand, and on the other hand, it's just not the same. Looking at a screen to see who's in the room, in the Zoom room isn't the same as, sitting there reflecting and seeing the other folks who are sitting on benches with you, that the whole atmosphere of the meeting space doesn't feel the same to me. And I am concerned about the lack of vocal ministry. And on the other hand, I don't want us to become sort of performers in case, oh, there's a visitor here, I should stand up and give a message so that he understands what it's like to be in a real meeting for worship. Is there a balance there? Is there, so I have a lot of questions about this topic, and I'm hoping, Barry, that you can kind of guide us through that and give us sort of your take on when does vocal ministry happen? Is it, supposed to come from within? You're supposed to feel that leading. Is it always that way? So I'm interested to hear what you have to say. And I was trying to kill a mosquito. We got a few mosquitoes in here. So.
Understood. We've been having them wander in our place as well recently. So I really appreciate you sharing. And actually, I just want to stop. Has everyone shared that wishes to share before we go on?
I could share. I have found the Zoom situation somewhat intimidating, and but I also have had a series of mishaps which limit me, so that I'm not yet able to attend the open meeting. So I'm stuck here in Zoom, which is a depressing thing in itself.
Thank you for sharing. And welcome, Will. Glad you've joined us. So I really appreciate that you've all shared because, in a sense, yes, what I was imagining that I would talk about was to take you through um, the "Are You Called to Speak" cycle. You may have seen the illustration that Brent and I prepared. And simultaneously, I wanted to understand where everyone is in this moment, because my experience is that, yes, there are guides to vocal ministry, but vocal ministry, in a sense, is also a culture within a meeting to a degree. There's all the expectations that are spoken and unspoken that build up over a period of years. They are, for some members of the meeting, they're very alive and well known, and for other people, sometimes visitors or newcomers, they're not understood at all. And I also want to acknowledge a piece, because I've experienced it as you've all experienced it. Arch Street is a little bit different than many meetings. The number of visitors is relatively high compared to a lot of other meetings. And as you pointed out, many of those folks are new. Some might even be tourists. And I think it's relatively easy sometimes for it to go through one's mind of, am I to be doing something for the benefit of these folks who are looking for a Quaker experience? And, I think the motivation behind that is positive, because it's in some ways the same motivation that I think is supposed to undergird meeting for worship itself, which is that we are collecting together in spirit in order to be of benefit one to another through the presence of spirit, and hopefully be a conduit for spirit. And that conduit can be in the form of vocal ministry. The conduit may be in non-vocal communion that's experienced as we sit together, and either is fine. But from my perspective, what we're looking for is we're looking for that nudge that sometimes it's stronger than a nudge. It might be an in-breaking or a push that says that there's something that's going on within me that is more than me simply thinking about an issue. And I think a key to that sometimes is actually preparation. As I'm hearing you all share that more vocal ministry would be welcome, if it were centered and grounded vocal ministry. One thing to consider is your own preparation before meeting for worship. I imagine a number of you have read it, but there's a wonderful Pendle Hill pamphlet called 4 Doors to Meeting for Worship. And 4 Doors is one of my favorite pamphlets because it talks about the various ways one can prepare before ever having set foot in the meeting. And that the idea is that there is this opportunity for us to prepare ourselves to be vessels for spirit, so that when we actually do show up in worship, that we have some centering and some grounding that will allow us to move into that space more easily, to hear more easily, and also to hopefully respond more easily. I think several Quaker authors have referred to it as stepping into the stream of spirit. And for me, one of the tests that I think about as well, so I think one of the things that I'll share personally that I fight is doing what I call the laundry list. I will sit down and worship, and if it's been a particularly heavy week, I'll start recounting what are some of the things that I think need to happen. And it will take me a couple of minutes to start to let go of that. And some of the ways that I try and let go of that is I do use mantras to try and settle my mind. Repetitive words or phrases. Sometimes I'll repeat prayers in my mind. Sometimes I'll do what a Quaker elder had taught me at one point, which was to pray for everyone in turn in the room. And I've actually found that particular piece to be really, really helpful. There's something about praying for people in the room in turn that, at least for me, helps me begin to center on the reason why we're here, which is to be present to one another and to be present to spirit, and to be a community while we're gathered together, whether that gathering together is Zoom or whether that gathering together is in person, and to start to move through that cycle. Hopefully at that point there might be something that's forming, and I want to share that vocal ministry for me is not frequent. Vocal ministry for me, as you probably experienced when I was living in Philadelphia, I maybe only stood one out of every 4 or 5 meetings. Did I feel like something was more than my own thoughts? And so a very conscious way to work with that is to say, is, as one of you already brought up, is this message for me, or is this message for others? Is this for someone else or for others in the meeting? And to sit with that for a little while. And part of what I often say is, if I'm unsure, stay in worship. Sit with it a while longer. Continue to test. If you come to a point where it is for the community, feel some confidence that that might be true. And there's more refining to do. I heard a couple of you share a little bit of perhaps nervousness around, what is appropriate sharing. And so I feel like there's some additional tests that can help with that. One is the question of, am I responding to an earlier speaker? And I think there's a difference between responding to an earlier speaker and building on the ministry that has been given. Sometimes someone will deliver a powerful message, and we will feel not only deeply moved by the message, but there may be this strong feeling that begins to build that there is something more to add to that message, that reinforces it, that builds upon it in some way, that elucidates some thread. And I think that can be very powerful vocal ministry. In fact, I've experienced that a number of times at Arch with you all, where it felt like a thread of ministry developed within the community and stretched through the worship. And I think that can be wonderful. What can also sometimes happen is we can simply be responding to what someone has said. And when I say responding, it's not always, it could be positive or negative, but sometimes we can test that. Am I simply making an intellectual statement? Am I responding in a way of, I've analyzed what they've said and I have a thought about this? If that's the case, then I think we need to return to worship. If it's something that has prompted a thought in you, you can again go back to the test of, is this for me or is this for the community? Because it may be that it's for you. It could be that it's something that you want to clarify with the speaker, but that's something that can wait until after worship. The test is really, is this from Spirit? Is this for the community? And then I think a further refining happens when we think about, where is the community right now? Because I think someone had mentioned the ministry of NPR earlier, and I think sometimes what happens with that is assumptions get made about the composition of the room, especially when it comes to politics or particular strands of how we may have been educated or how we may have grown up. And I think when we allow those sorts of assumptions to creep in, it takes us away from vocal ministry. And so sometimes to me, the question of, is this grounded ministry? Is this prophetic ministry? If we're getting into lots of details about how like let's say that there's a challenge that we're perceiving in the world, just for sake of argument, let's say it's around poverty. My own sense is that Spirit will often want us to speak about those things. If we're experiencing an injustice, that prophetic voice, Spirit can sometimes push us to speak about those things. When it's one thing to speak on the issue, it's another thing to start offering solutions to the problem. And I think that's where we sometimes start to go from prophetic ministry into the political or into partisanship. And political and partisanship in and of themselves are to me, not a problem. I feel like many of the things that we have to work out in the world, we work out through politics. But in terms of that call of the prophetic during vocal ministry, what can sometimes I think be more powerful is to make an invitation to the meeting, in a sense, that the issue has been raised, that Spirit has had us speak to it in a profound way, and that the call is an opportunity for us to talk about it, not to lay out the solution, but to lay out an invitation for us to be in dialogue. At some point, after the meeting, people can come and talk to you. Those are the times when you can start to explore what solutions might look like. But I think vocal ministry itself is just trying to, often Spirit is just trying to call us into awareness. And of course, a last test is it clear? I think we've all experienced someone, and I must admit not often, thankfully, but someone has stood and they have given ministry and they sat down and I thought, I do not know what they were talking about. And so one of the tests is not only is this for the community, is it building upon the ministry? Is it something the Spirit is having me give rather than a response to the speaker? But also, have I sat with this long enough to feel clear about the message and the wording of the message to deliver so that I'm being a good conduit for Spirit to deliver the message into the room? So those are a few of the tests that I sometimes think about. If you don't mind, I'll speak for just a couple of minutes about part of what I'm hearing you all speak in the room, which is that in the current moment we find ourselves, there's not a lot of people at worship in person yet, and that is a particular challenge. And a few things come up for me with that, which one is that with all the health concerns, I understand why that would be, and I think meetings all over are having that experience right now. And with that said, I think on the one hand, having more people in ministry or more people in worship can create a setting where there might be an opportunity for more people to share vocal ministry. On the other hand, I'll say that on a number of occasions, some of the most powerful ministry I have ever experienced was in relatively small groups. Whether it was worshiping on a weekend at Pendle Hill, and there might have been 5 or 7 of us in the room. It may have been a worship sharing group, and that we decided to stay and worship afterwards. And those 2 particular images that I bring up in part to say that sometimes I believe vocal ministry, powerful vocal ministry, comes in part because we have grounded ourselves and we're receptive to it. So that act of having been in community in a worship sharing session before we actually then did worship meant that we were readied in a sense, and that ministry had a tendency to come. I think I've seen that happen too when there's been adult religious education and there's been some rich sharing before we then settled into silence. It's also, I've experienced it because there have been, there was one meeting that I went to that for a little while where the the experience of worship was pretty powerful on the two. I think I was there 3 times. I was coming in and out over a short period of time, and there was some really powerful worship that happened in those few visits that I had. And I asked someone about it, and it was really interesting because they said, "Oh, I think that happens at our meeting because we have 2 elders who come a full hour before meeting for worship, and they ground the room. And we have an understanding in our meeting that everybody who comes into the room, into the worship space itself, are to come in prepared to worship. That all conversation ends outside of the worship room doors as people are coming in. And our experience has been that it becomes a much more grounded space where vocal ministry has become more powerful in that sort of setting. So I'm not saying those things should be done. I'm just saying that I think there are places that have had experiences that have told them there are maybe ways to prepare the ground for more vocal ministry that might have depth, even if the numbers are not high. So as I say this, I wonder what is coming up for you all? What are there any pieces that I've shared so far that you want to explore further, that concern you, that speak to you? What's rising for you all?
Barry, I remember reading that William Penn spent all week planning on what he would say for his message. Do you think that's something that is worth doing, or is it, just William Penn?
It's interesting. I appreciate you bringing that up because I think prepared ministry is controversial with some friends. And, William Penn was known for it. Rufus Jones was known for it. And there were people who thought that Rufus Jones sometimes gave very powerful prepared ministry. And there were also, I've heard stories from some people that were students of his, which I'm not sure that they're with us anymore, but who talked about you could pretty much set your watch by what point in the meeting Rufus Jones was going to rise and deliver ministry. And they were speaking to it as that I think they themselves carried some expectation that vocal ministry was something that was spontaneous. I personally believe either is fine. The question is, what is the expectation of the meeting? Where is the meeting with prepared ministry? And I also want to say that when it comes to prepared ministry, I think there's a big difference between something that is relatively short and clear, that the person has been sitting with that week and has been sitting on their heart and they have been wrestling with in a spiritual sense, and that they are feeling compelled to bring that into the meeting, and that they feel that Spirit is asking them to share with the meeting. I think it's something else entirely, that somebody perhaps unfolds a sermon that they had read that they thought was great, and was a nice piece of writing, and got up to share it without necessarily feeling led. I think that's a critical piece, is that preparing is fine as long as that morning you are feeling that nudge of spirit that, yes, indeed, this is something for the community, not just something that I myself find important or moving. I wonder if there, for any of you, if there has been vocal ministry that was powerful, that you experienced, that still resonates, that you remember, that you would want to share. Because sometimes I think in a sharing ministry that we have experienced as meaningful or powerful or beautiful, it says something to all of us in the meeting about how spirit can move amongst us.
I don't remember particular messages, but I remember the folks who did give vocal ministry in our meeting. I could say it at the names of about 6 or 8 people right now, and that's what, you know, that stays with me. And some of them, it would be sort of a seasonal thing. They'd be responding to nature outdoors and, you know, the birds tweeting. And some, you know, there were a couple of folks whose messages centered around that. But they were different from others. So it's really sort of the person who was giving the message, who's stayed with me, and they're all gone. You know, they're all now deceased, the ones I'm thinking of. But what am I trying to say? That was a gift at the time that stayed, especially for me. I didn't come from a Quaker tradition, so it was during the time that I was learning what it is to be a Quaker. I just want to insert a little bit to your previous question that Tom and I were at in-person worship at Arch Street. There were only nine of us this morning, but one of them was someone who had attended several years ago, moved away, and then has come back. And he and I had a little conversation, and he shared with me where he had worshiped in Florida. And he mentioned that one of the groups that he worshiped with had an intentional sort of worship sharing time, as you mentioned, in the hour before the actual serve. I think they were actually Unitarians. We won't hold that against them, but they had a moderator, and he's sometimes it veered into a political message or political worship sharing kind of a thing. But then they were all, as you said, everybody was kind of primed then for the time when they went into their regular service. And he said that, you know, if there were 40 people in worship, probably 30 of them had participated beforehand in the worship sharing hour. And I was really intrigued by that. And then you kind of repeated that notion. So it's that is staying with me.
I'm recalling the ministry of a member who has since transferred to another meeting, but this was a person who had been I believe, a Jesuit priest who at some point decided to become a friend. But he always approached his message with a certain sense of, with humor and kind of a philosophical, detachment from multiple angles. Obviously, someone who had received real training in ministry, I know in the past there was kind of a tradition of recognizing recorded ministers of people who really had gifts. But in this case, this was someone coming from, the Catholic tradition and a trained minister, but just how enriching that was for our meeting to have someone with that gift who had, honed those skills in a more formal setting. And I just wonder you know, what mechanisms are available today in the Society of Friends to give more formal training to those that really have a gift to kind of accentuate their contribution to meetings.
Thank you for that, Tom. I actually would like to pause there and see, is there anyone who knows of resources around that piece? A couple of things come to mind, but rather than me sharing, I would love to hear from all of you. So I'll go ahead then. And one of the things that goes through my mind is I feel like there School of the Spirit. I don't know how many of you have either gone through School of the Spirit or are familiar with School of the Spirit. Hands. Okay. So School of the Spirit sometimes offers different programs, but usually my experience has been that people who will choose to do School of the Spirit programming, often their vocal ministry becomes more powerful. And I think part of why that happens is the nature of the way School of the Spirit is designed, that people go through as a cohort, that they're meeting about once every quarter. They have assignments. Basically, it's a deepening process. It's a ministerial process that I think can be very beneficial. Outside of that, part of what's going through my mind is it may be time for Pendle Hill to offer something along these lines. Years ago, Marcel Martin and I decided to offer a 4-day retreat on how to basically center and prepare oneself for worship, and maybe time for something specifically on vocal ministry for those who are interested. It's another piece. It also goes through my mind just to share that I think sometimes meditating on what I call the qualities of vocal ministry can be very helpful. And because I think there are certain qualities to vocal ministry that uplifts the community. And I'm going to turn to the page where I've made some notes around that. But I think some of the qualities of vocal ministry that kind of help us understand that Spirit is nudging us is that what is being formed to say has an element of love in it, or beauty, or that there's a persistence or a rightness to it, a feeling of harmony around our ideas of what is spirit or what is God, and that it sometimes has what I would call a call to the heart. I explain this as the words sit with me, I feel my heart opening, and in that way, for me, it can verify that this is something important for those assembled, and gives me some confidence that if I stand to speak, that it may be a form of service to others. I also think that devotional reading can also help prepare someone for vocal ministry, and also the form that worship sharing takes, I think, can be really important. Um, if you were to try and do worship sharing as a preliminary to meeting for worship, and what I'm about to share, I think, is true both in worship sharing, but it's also true around vocal ministry. That sometimes Spirit comes through most powerfully in our vulnerability. And so I think there are times, and this is one of the tests for us as we're getting ready to speak. It may be that something that we're feeling nudged to share comes out of a very personal event, or comes out of a very an unfolding that was deeply impactful for us. And a question um, is the event itself something for us to share, or is it the learning or the experience that came of it that we are to share? Sometime, and there's no, to me, rote answer to that. Sometimes what Spirit is asking us to do is to share the thing, the experience itself, and the learning of it that was powerful, because that's what's going to resonate. That's what's going to bring into other people's hearts the truth of what's being spoken into the room. At other times, the experience is just for you, but the learning is important for someone else. Sometimes in worship sharing, what I think can be really powerful is when those who are facilitating take the time to think about queries that are going to ask people, in a sense, to make that determination for themselves as they enter into worship sharing one with another. And so, sometimes queries can be very general, but sometimes queries can help elicit very personal experiences that don't have to be answered in that way. We can always pass in worship sharing. We can always generalize in worship sharing. But to have queries that can reach more deeply into our lived experience and help us share with one another in that circle, at least in my experience, can help us go deeper with the people in our meeting that we're in community with. And what's important about that, to my mind, from vocal ministry, is that carries over then into the shared ministry for worship. I was part of a worship group in Taos, New Mexico, that often there was about 7 or 8 of us. But one of the members, he was 100 years old, and he came to meeting for worship as faithfully and regularly as his health would allow. He was there quite frequently. And I think there was something about his longevity and his presence that others in the meeting found very grounding. And it wasn't that he always was sharing about a personal experience that transformed him, but he was often speaking about the value of community itself. And sometimes he would speak from a place that you could feel was deeply grounded about the value of vocal ministry to the community, which was really interesting because in a way he was sharing religious education as part of vocal ministry. I think we sometimes think of vocal ministry as being about issues, something that's prophetic, something about the outside world, or it could be about relating to personal experience. But there are also times when vocal ministry can be about what I might call the religious journey itself, the spiritual journey itself, our relationship to God, and speaking about ways to be in communion. And that too can be really powerful. And I feel like some of what he sometimes said about vocal ministry and its value and its importance really helped deepen the meeting itself. So that combination of worship, sharing, and the validation of the importance of vocal ministry, I think can be very moving. And in fact, I know one of you spoke earlier tonight about feeling like vocal ministry is disincentivized, perhaps, in meeting. I have not seen this often, but there are a couple of meetings that I have attended where the clerk, I think, viewed their role a little differently. That in the act of convening meeting for worship, I have definitely experienced where the convener was there to welcome and to help settle the room and to break the meeting at the end. But I've also had the experience that the person who convened, and Arch Street has done this, there have been times when queries have been lifted, but I've also had the experience that someone will actually speak to vocal ministry as an act of settling the room, of inviting vocal ministry, um, explaining how vocal ministry works. In a way, it's almost like when someone is acting as a facilitator for worship sharing and they go through, this is what worship sharing is, so that everyone is in that moment reminded of or on the same page around how this is going to work. And I have seen a convener invite everyone into both the process of centering, but also what it is to give vocal ministry and what the prompts might be in a very succinct but clear way. And that too can be an aid to vocal ministry if that's what is wanted in the meeting, is to, if you will, plow the ground to prepare the meeting for something that is felt as valuable. Is there anything that's rising?
Yes, I find it very helpful because once a month, at the beginning of the month, the person who breaks the meeting reads from Faith and Practice. And I really like that.
When I hear you say that, part of what comes up for me um, is to share that I believe all of this is a holy experiment, and that if the meeting is so moved, there's nothing wrong with experiment, with changing the format in small or large ways, as long as there's consent from the body to try some new things and to see what it elicits. Because ultimately our faithfulness is about being present for one another and about being present for spirit. So as long as the experiments are seeking that end, then I think it's deeply in keeping with the nature of who we say we are as friends, especially in terms of, we always say that we believe in continuing revelation. So the form of our worship, while I think the core remains intact always, what we can choose to do around the opening and the closing of worship can sometimes have both subtle and profound impacts upon how we experience ourselves as a community.
Barry, do you have some suggestions, specific things that our meeting might try as experiments?
Well, I think some of it we've spoken about so far this evening. I personally really do love worship sharing. I think it's a fantastic tool on all sorts of levels. Um, I think that especially in terms of community building, I think it's a fantastic tool, not just as something that can further ministry and during times of worship. Um, But beyond that, I know that Philadelphia Yearly Meeting often has a book that's chosen for the entire meeting to read. And I know that, that's supposed to extend for the yearly meeting, but I think sometimes meetings can choose certain short devotional works to suggest as common reading during certain periods of time or as a prelude to certain worships. There's also something else that I have seen tried, and I think it can have amazing impacts, but it usually speaks to a small subset of the meeting, which is extended meeting for worship. And I don't know if any of you have experienced extended meeting for worship. Um, But it's something I've done a number of times at Pendle Hill, and once or twice at other venues. The longest extended worship that I've been a part of was 3 hours, and I have actually found it to be a really interesting form of spiritual discipline to engage in 2 or 3 hours of worship rather than one. I find that it creates a different flow to the gathering of the body. And in particular, for reasons I can't explain, my experience has been that somewhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours, sometimes really, really deep vocal ministry starts to emerge, in part because perhaps the communion has deepened. The way that it can, I think, be beneficial to the meeting as a whole, even if there's a small group that partakes in it, is that I sometimes believe that it really only takes a handful of people to really ground a meeting and to change its trajectory. And I'm thinking, Sandra, of you talking, and Tom as well, you each talked about individuals, that your experience of them in meeting was profound and changed the meeting. And so I suggest that as it doesn't always require all of the meeting shifting or having a powerful experience. Sometimes what can happen is a handful of people find themselves engaging in a depth of practice that creates a different experience for the community as a whole.
Is there a set of guidelines for how to do worship sharing that you would recommend?
There are. I'm not remembering the link offhand, but Audrey, I believe the FGC website has
I
a
think
worship
it's in,
share.
oops, sorry. I think it may be in Spiritual Deepening Library.
That's right.
I can find it and share that with you, Lois.
Thank you, Audrey.
Sure. I think since so many friends are new, there aren't many friends who were raised as Quakers. It is hard to learn or come to understand what is appropriate vocal ministry. When do you speak? And I'm sure there are many people who they are afraid to speak because they don't know what is okay. They may feel moved, but they think, oh, this is too unimportant. And I mean, when I think back to certain vocal ministry, is that me whistling? Okay, well, sorry. When I think back to certain vocal ministry, that was real, that stayed with me. Some of it, I could see where somebody else might think, oh, that's not important. But I'm thinking of Janet Shepherd talking about celebrating life, celebrating the day, even when we're in the midst of difficult times. I don't know if anyone else was there for this. It's a good while ago, but it just had to do with during the Vietnam War, and there were protests going on, and she was walking past a store and saw a pretty dress, and she thought, oh, maybe I should buy that. And then she kind of chastised herself for saying, oh, how could I think of something so trivial? So, but then she thought, we're still here, we're still existing. I still have to wear something. So if I want to wear a pretty dress, I can still celebrate what I can and still do the work to address heavy things. So celebrate the day. That stayed with me. It's been probably 25 years since I heard that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I just want to express appreciation to you all for sharing tonight, because I said it at the beginning, but I think it's ultimately true that what we're doing right now is how we deepen. It's this sort of sharing, because while, yes, the pamphlet that Bryn and I wrote on vocal ministry hopefully has some helpful things about the nature of vocal ministry and how one might give authentic vocal ministry. Really, I feel like authentic vocal ministry arises out of our relationships. It arises out of our relationships with one another, and it arises out of our relationship with Spirit. And so the act of us all being in relationship is part of what sets the tone to have these powerful experiences and to have these moments where, like you're sharing, Audrey, that someone touched your life and it has stayed with you for so many years. To me, that is the ultimate value of vocal ministry, is in subtle and profound ways it changes the trajectory of how we think about the world. Before we conclude tonight, is there anything else that's rising for any of you, or that would be helpful to you?
You talked about grounding and maybe coming prior to the meeting to ground, get the play grounded and you grounded. And I found that on Wednesday nights a lot years ago when we could meet on Wednesday nights and so forth. And Mary, you were there on a number of Wednesday evenings, and I felt very grounded there. And with a real small group, there was some vocal students coming in to visit and so forth. There are other visitors as well, and I always found that very worthwhile.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Will. And it's good to see you. Well, I see the time. Are we at a good point to close? Is everyone easy? Shall we have just a minute or two of shared worship before we sign off for the evening? All right, let's settle in for a moment. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lois, for inviting me tonight. It's good to be with you all, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your night.
Thank you, Barry.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.